Perfect.
Sorry about that. I totally forgot this meeting was happening.
Too busy releasing pack. You're right on time.
Wasn't me. It was Dan.
Nice.
Okay. I guess to start off, people can remember to sign into the doc, myself included. That'd be great. Cord meeting. Anybody have any status updates relevant?
Yeah, I guess a new version of pack 0.17.0 was just cut. It does look like some of the homebrew stuff might be a little wonky, but so I'll be fixing that today.
Oh, sorry. That's probably because of the M1 stuff, right?
Who knows? Yeah.
Okay. But otherwise, okay, great. I guess we'll get into the release planning stuff. And you also did work. You have a draft PR for Platform API 6, right?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so that helps for the lifecycle folk people. I did a whole bunch of small PRs for acceptance tests and a bit of docs within that. And we adding M1 to trying to add M1 to the release. At least the binary should be on the pack release. Yeah.
I have a quick one in regards to Tecton. So I just finished creating a test workflow, GitHub action for the Tecton integration repo via kind, right? The only thing it looks like GitHub actions are having some issues right now. Their performance is degraded. So waiting for that to complete and then merge that in and go on to the next item. I think one of the things that I want to maybe discuss among this group, I'll add it to the agenda, is the platform API versions for Tecton, what the strategy there should be. I have something in mind I'd like to propose, but we could have a larger discussion.
Okay, fantastic. Next, I guess, is release planning or release discussion. So you said, Dan, went over well. Any of that was the homebrew pipeline, the only one that that didn't work for the release?
Sorry. TBD. Some of the Linux ones just finished their like own binary building step. So I'm gonna go verify all the Ubuntu ones and then I'll do the Arch Linux one. But I've just been poking around at homebrew right now. So
great. Okay. So based on our needs discussion, our comments last week. So I prepped a few things that I thought maybe we should have need discussion for a while. But how about let's skip that. Let's first do other topics in the working group because those have been around for a bit, and then we will go to the needs discussion as we have time, I guess, if that works for everybody. Great. Javier, you want to talk about the Tecton platform API version?
Yeah, so I guess as we're talking about, adding support to something like Pack, I think it makes a lot of sense in kind of keeping as close as possible to the latest and greatest version of the platform API. But I guess I have some concerns about how we would be able to achieve that for something that's a little bit more complex like Tecton, because obviously like it's essentially a whole different task, right, per platform API version. So if you think about as we're iterating through all of these, it seems very painful to have, like, let's say right now, I guess I probably want to have 3 different versions, platform API 03 to 6. And so that's 3 versions and we have 2 tasks. So that's like 6 versions, right? And then we're going to have platform API, the next iteration of platform API, coming up here. It seems like we release maybe every 3 months. And so yeah, like I feel like it's going to snowball into this like maintenance hell. that, and then the other aspect, I guess that like I maybe want to throw into this formula of trying to figure out exactly what to use is how fast do the actual builders update the lifecycle that they're using with that platform API, right? And whether or not we should be taking that into consideration to determine exactly what we should support from a Tecton perspective. Any initial thoughts, I guess dislikes there?
I'll say I think the Heroku builder it's not always up to date on the latest life cycle. So I think, there would be some concern about lagging behind enough that Tecton's unusable, but I mean, we could also get better at that.
Yeah, is there a reason why, other than like don't change stuff when it works kind of thing? Is there a reason why it doesn't get updated as soon as lifecycle releases?
We just don't have the automation for that built in. I mean, it's just sort of just haven't really needed it much, but we should probably work towards doing some of that.
Yeah. I mean, it also, I guess, when we were doing a bunch of that work at the time, it also would break our stuff back then. Which I think is part of why we didn't invest in automation.
And so is the proposal here that Tecton would like interrogate the lifecycle in the builder to figure out what the latest version is to run? Like, how would that work? Because that's what Pack does, right?
Yeah, see, that's the thing. Like, I don't know, like everything, like the Tecton tasks are pretty dumb, right? We've often called it like a simple platform or a dumb platform. And I can't think of a proper strategy for the execution of the life cycle to essentially change, right, from one task to the other.
Yeah, we've had similar questions here. Like right now, I think we're still defaulted to whatever the default of lifecycle is when it's not specified, which is 0.3, which is quite old in platform. On one of the platforms we're working on, because we just don't set it because we don't know what the builder is going to be. We haven't done the work to like interrogate the builder to figure out what version like Pack does.
Yeah. Like if I'm looking at the builders right now, Heroku supports Platform API 05 as the latest. Google's builder supports 04, right? Like I think like they would probably even stay further behind as well. And it seems like we got 06. Is that the latest that's coming up? Is that right?
Yeah, it's being worked on
Yeah.
now.
So like my initial, like my instinct, right, is to support like the majority supported platform API and just kind of stick to that until we find a better solution long term. So right now it would be 04. And as far as I'm aware, like the lifecycle will never break that compatibility. So it would just be newer features that might not be available. Kind of, it's not
Would it be
ideal, but
would it be like an explicit n-1, or is that, or
but
just
I guess
into
the
04?
problem, if we become an n-1, it goes back to the argument that we move fast enough or we iterate fast enough in the life cycle that essentially it'll grow to a pretty big extent. Like I'd rather focus my efforts on supporting the two tests that we have and adding pipelines. So like pipelines are something that, would be nice to have, or we could just pluck it from the catalog and it would have like a fully working workflow for individuals. So again, that kind of adds to the number of things that we'd support. So for the time being, I'd kind of be against an n-1 situation and
Okay.
just be a majority supported platform API version. And then I could do some research to figure out whether or not there's some sort of dynamic solution within Tecton.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's gonna get kind of wild, like because I think in either 0.7 or 0.6, like potentially switching the order of the, of detector and analyzer, like that would be a big one that you couldn't just suddenly support and not support at the same time without two different templates in something like Tecton, right?
Yep.
Unless you're just using Creator.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like we have a creator workflow, but then we have the individual phases for the security aspect. So, anyways, just throwing the initial idea out there with the current strategy, but I do think we probably want to solve this, in the near future, because I'm sure this is just one pain point, and other platforms are going to fall into the same pain point.
Interesting. Makes a lot of sense.
Cool.
That could tie into our Tecton versioning also. Maybe we can version the tasks based on platform API. Although that you may have to, I guess, for with platform 06 with the switch for binaries. But
So the way that the Tecton catalog works is like they're treated as immutable versions, right? So if you wanted to apply a fix or additional features to, let's say, platform API 04, you'd have to actually bump to 05,
version.
which
Okay.
which collide with that. So I don't think that would work.
Okay, I wasn't sure at this point whether they were all in on immutability, but looks like they are. Okay, fine.
Yep. Cool.
It's
I'll keep
kinda-
digging, but I'll see what I could find.
This does seem like it's going to be a problem. Like just the reorganizing of like the execution steps. Like you could never really write something that would support both like easily. Like if you just support every builder out there, like you would at some point have to choose to drop like platform before that, right? Like,
Use creator.
yeah, but it's only for trusted scenarios, right? Like if you don't trust the builder,
Right.
then you definitely don't trust them with your registry credentials.
It's definitely fair. I think next thing on the agenda, if this is done, if we're happy to stick on it for longer, was the Windows SID RFC. I see, Micah, you wanted to talk about that?
Yeah, and I gave a pretty good sort of detailed internal implementation explanation in the other subteam. So I figured I could talk to this from sort of a platform perspective and not quite go quite so deep into that, if that's useful. But I did have some particular questions around how to treat platform API versioning with this potential change. The gist is, feel free to click in, but the verbal gist is that in stack build images, we'll stop using CNB user ID for Windows. Instead, use CNB user SID, and then their group equivalents as well. SIDs are like strings, but they're meant to express the same thing as a UID, just a unique identifier for a particular user on an image. From the platform perspective, all that really changes is that you have to validate that like when you're creating a builder from that build image, you'd want to make sure that that environment variable is the Windows version on a Windows image. And then when you call the lifecycle, you'd call the lifecycle with a different argument rather than dash UID, you'd call it with dash USID. Still like the same analogs all the way throughout. You just use this different identifier for each Windows user as opposed to the Linux user. And also from a platform perspective, if like platforms like Pack that make build packages, builders, those types of things where you're applying specific user ownership on files that end up in those resultant images, you would need to, rather than setting like the tar header.uid, you'd set the tar header.paxheader.sid or raw SID. There's more gory details in there, but basically you just stop setting the tar UID and start setting this Windows specific equivalent. So more and more details in the RFC itself. But I'm kind of wondering, since this is changes both to incoming build images, incoming builders, and how we call the lifecycle binaries that are inside of there, seems like it kind of maybe creates a unique kind of API bumping situation. I'm wondering, first of all, how much y'all care about Windows image changes since it's still experimental, if it warrants both a lifecycle version bump and a platform API version bump. If yes, then how much backward compatibility we might want, how much we want to support sort of old formatted builders and new platform API platforms, or all those kinds of things. Or if we just want to say Windows images are experimental, let's just say old images don't work anymore, make them all the new way. And any, yeah, I don't know if y'all had, I know it's a lot to kind of dump on there, but I don't know if y'all had any thoughts on that.
I think from my perspective, anything that changes the spec is thereby a change to the API, right? And because the APIs are pretty, I guess you could say, like isolated in a sense. I don't think that we talk too much about like compatibility from that aspect, right? And so when we talk about a specific builder image, I think we could talk about what that image is really supporting. But I guess maybe what you're discussing is like the fact that the lifecycle itself supports multiple platform APIs, right? And how that really affects this particular, or how this issue really affects that particular uh, attempt to support that.
I think so, and mainly just so I can codify it in the RFC to talk about it. But if it would actually be more useful for me to not answer that question in the RFC text and leave it open for discussion in the RFC comments, I'm also happy to do that if we want to have more context when we talk about it. But yeah, it is around that of sort of the intercompatibility and intercompatibility of the lifecycle and supported platforms intersected with Windows images being experimental. Yeah, so would you all, is that worth discussing now, or should I try and make it discussable in the RFC?
So I think from like a platform perspective, we're kind of at the mercy of whatever the implementation team decides on here. I feel like it's really more in their arena of what they're willing to compromise, right? If they're saying that a version of the life cycle can live inside of a builder that can, be essentially cross compatible between different versions of platform APIs. It's really up to them to say like, oh, you know what, in this particular case, we're gonna have to break that contract. And I think that discussion is better suited there because from, again, the platform side of things, we could probably like work with both of them, right? Like at least pack, right? It could do something very dynamic where it could essentially be passing both the tar headers and also the other thing, right? Depending on which environment variables it has present and stuff like that. But it's really the implementation team that decides whether or not they want to provide that level of backwards compatibility.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'll try and frame it around that too. My suspicion is that pack itself, thankfully, I think as far as headers go, can just completely switch over to doing it the new way for build packages and that. Yeah, just right.
But if they have that information though, right? Like that's the thing. So if we don't have that information, and that's where I was going to ask whether, it warrants new environment variables, or if the current environment variables could be overloaded to represent SIDs when you're talking about UIDs, right? But I think that's a RFC conversation.
Perfect. Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Awesome. Thanks for the feedback, and I'll update the RFC with the context there.
It's fun. I mean, I guess we always see this, but it's always funny seeing how we kind of assume everything's ultimately compatible, and it's not always so simple. So thank you for putting in the work for that. Bunch of issues for needs discussion. One I thought Dan may have some opinion on. That is that we recently in this release did some work on caching, specifically allowing people to have or to publish their cache images And related to that, we also talked about that was kind of related to volumes. So there was an ask from a user to define cache volume names. I assume that would be based on a flag, and passing those names to the lifecycle, I guess. No, never mind. It had a discussion needed tag for a while. I was wondering whether anybody had, first of all, remembered seeing this issue, and whether anybody had any opinions on it.
So I think Emily was initially kind of against the idea, but I think the need for it has come up more and more. The alternative, so I guess some context, the alternative for this was that the users are able to do volume mounts, right, to wherever they want, somewhere like M2 cache, and just kind of know what is behind the scenes of the Buildpack implementation of where that's going to be. But in this particular case, because we've already provided cache image where they're able to kind of plop in an image for caching certain things, and use that cache image across different quote unquote applications, right? It seems reasonable to allow for the exact same support with volumes. And so I'm in the stance where we should be able, or we should allow the users to be able to kind of enable that functionality, but it not be the default, right? Like it's more or less like you know what you're doing and you understand the risk of essentially, which is cache poisoning, but they again can do that right now with cache image.
Okay, so
Does that
I'll,
somewhat answer
so,
or give you some context?
so you think that to go pretty much, and it's definitely. Do we need to do anything in terms of we pass the volume caches, and are they are passed to the lifecycle, right? So do we need to? Is there any change in how that's done that we would just pass in the new names?
Yeah, I mean, I think it should be very simple. I think it was controversial at first, but I think once we remove the controversial aspect, it's a simple ask. The only thing I'm thinking about, it's the whole directory, right? So like I know we have different volumes that we use. There's like a launch cache, and then there's the other volume.
Build,
I don't know if that
build,
plays
and
into
that build
build
and
and
that
cache.
launch.
Yeah. So if anything, it would be a prefix, but I don't know that we actually need to provide both of them to be configurable. Because if I remember correctly, there's only one that the lifecycle accepts, the cache stir.
Okay, all right, that makes sense. The second, so less discussion there now. The second was an ask from Natalie about Pack preferring lifecycle API versions over released versions.
Say that again.
Pack should prefer lifecycle API version over release version.
I completely agree with that.
Okay.
The only
Should
thing,
we be assigning a default lifecycle version at all? Is that something people think makes sense, or there would be some integration with? Would that remove the Pack's knowledge of a default lifecycle version, or we would just assume that it's more that they would Pack would still know a default lifecycle version. It would just prefer talking about lifecycle versions, lifecycle API versions.
it's really platform API versions, right?
Okay.
So the idea here is that somehow it should communicate with like the repository, the lifecycle repository, and the releases, and the releases should have enough information to tell us what platform API version it is. And then Pack should know what the, I guess, latest supported platform API version is, and then essentially select the latest there as well.
And I think
Is that more or less the strategy?
Yeah, just adding, because I think Emily had said now that the life cycle is making this sort of backwards compatibility guarantee, you can always just take the latest life cycle, because for any given platform API, yes, it will be supported, right? So
That is interesting. It does definitely simplify it. But no, I guess that should work. I was thinking about Jesse's comment earlier about there potentially being this upcoming case where the life cycle, the orders are going to change, so it's going to be a harder break. But I think this still would work.
Would it work if the builder sort of intends to ship their own life cycle? It only
Right.
works if we're expecting them to use the exact life cycle we distribute, right? Or whatever. I mean, because it's not really, yeah, if they're expecting it to be 0.3 and they ship their own life cycle or something, then you try to execute something past that. It should work according to spec, but it may not work the way the builder intended, but maybe that's okay.
Cool. So I think for the purpose of this particular issue, though, I think what Natalie mentioned makes sense. Is there's no reason to introspect the lifecycle repo, and by default just pull the latest version when creating a new builder. Obviously, the user still can configure the builder toml to specify specific versions or specific URIs to pull lifecycle binaries.
So I have a note for that. Fantastic. Then the last one, no, never mind. We are at time. So I guess with that, everybody, thank you for coming, and I'll see you next week or later today, as the case may be. See ya.